There comes a moment in life when your reactions stop feeling automatic. Something happens that once would have shattered you, and instead, you feel space, not numbness, not suppression, space, the kind of space where an old trigger arrives and finds no one home. Carl Jung believed this moment marked the beginning of real psychological freedom, not enlightenment, not perfection, but the moment the shadow stops running the nervous system from behind the curtain. Most people believe their emotions are them. That anger, jealousy, fear, defensiveness are simply part of their personality. Jung disagreed. He believed most emotional reactions are not expressions of the self, but eruptions of the unconscious. And the shadow is the unconscious aspect of the personality that the ego refuses to identify with. In other words, your shadow is not who you are. It is what you have not yet faced. The shadow forms early. Every time you learned that an emotion was unsafe, every time love felt conditional, every time being authentic cost you connection, you adapted, you split, you buried parts of yourself so you could survive. And what gets buried does not disappear. It waits. It gathers energy. And eventually, it begins to live through you. This is why people say things like, "I don't know why I reacted like that," or "That's not who I want to be." Jung would say, that wasn't you. That was the shadow, momentarily in control. But here is the truth few people realize. The goal is not to destroy the shadow. The goal is to integrate it. Because once the shadow is integrated, it stops hijacking your energy. And when that happens, something unmistakable changes. Your life becomes quieter, clearer, more deliberate, not because the world stops provoking you, but because the shadow no longer needs to defend itself. This is where the signs begin. Not loud signs, not dramatic ones, but subtle, irreversible shifts in how energy moves through you. The first sign, your shadow no longer controls your energy, is this. You stop feeling the need to explain yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. In the shadow-dominated psyche, explanation is a survival strategy. You over-explain because somewhere inside, there is a frightened part of you, desperate to be seen as good, reasonable, or not wrong. Jung observed that the ego seeks validation when it is unsure of its own legitimacy. The shadow feeds on this. It says, if they understand you, you'll be safe. If they approve, you'll belong. If you clarify, you won't be rejected. But when the shadow loosens its grip, you begin to sense something deeper. That clarity does not come from being understood, but from being aligned. You still speak honestly. You still communicate clearly, but you no longer chase comprehension. You allow misunderstanding to exist without internal collapse, not because you don't care, but because your worth is no longer negotiated. This is not arrogance. It is integration. The second sign your shadow no longer controls your energy is that criticism stops feeling like an attack. When the shadow is active, criticism strikes buried wounds. A comment doesn't land in the present. It detonates the past. Old shame, old humiliation, old feelings of not being enough. So the nervous system reacts. Defensiveness, justification, withdrawal, anger. But when shadow material has been faced, something remarkable happens. Criticism becomes information. You can listen without collapsing. You can reject what isn't true without needing to prove anything. Jung believed that whatever emotionally overwhelms us has not yet been made conscious. So when criticism no longer overwhelms you, it means something profound. You have already met the parts of yourself that once needed defending. The shadow no longer has to fight for survival. The third sign, your shadow no longer controls your energy, is that you stop being magnetically pulled into emotional chaos. This is a big one. Shadow-dominated people are drawn to intensity, high-drama relationships, unstable dynamics, emotionally unavailable partners, situations that feel familiar, even when they hurt. Jung would say, the unconscious seeks resolution, So until the shadow is integrated, you will unconsciously recreate environments that mirror your unresolved inner conflicts. But when integration begins, your body starts rejecting chaos, not morally, somatically. Your nervous system no longer confuses intensity with intimacy. You feel exhausted by dysfunction, bored by manipulation, repelled by emotional games. Peace stops feeling empty and starts feeling rich. This is not avoidance. It is discernment. The fourth sign, your shadow no longer controls your energy, is that anger becomes clean. Most people think the absence of anger means growth. Jung knew better. Repressed anger does not disappear. It mutates. Passive aggression, bitterness, resentment, self-sabotage. When the shadow is integrated, anger does not vanish. It becomes precise. You no longer explode. You no longer suppress. You express boundaries without needing to wound. You feel anger without becoming it. This is a massive psychological shift because anger is life force, and when the shadow stops distorting it, that energy returns to you as clarity, confidence, and self-respect. The fifth sign, your shadow no longer controls your energy, is that you stop projecting evil onto others. Projection is the shadow's favorite defense. Anything we refuse to see in ourselves, we see everywhere else. The liar, the narcissist, the manipulator, the selfish one. Jung warned that the more intensely we judge something externally, the more likely it lives unconsciously within us. This does not mean you excuse harmful behavior. It means you stop needing villains to stabilize your identity. You can acknowledge wrongdoing without moral superiority. You can walk away without hatred. And this is the key difference. You stop giving emotional energy to people who no longer deserve psychological residence. The sixth sign, your shadow no longer controls your energy, is that solitude stops feeling threatening. For the shadow-dominated psyche, silence is dangerous because silence brings awareness, and awareness brings buried material. So people stay busy, distracted, stimulated. But once the shadow has been faced, solitude becomes nourishing, not lonely, clarifying. You can sit with yourself without the urge to escape. You can feel emotions without drowning in them. Jung believed the capacity to be alone is a direct measure of psychological maturity. When solitude no longer frightens you, it means the shadow is no longer waiting to ambush you from within. The seventh sign, your shadow no longer controls your energy, is the most subtle and the most powerful. You stop trying to be seen as healed. No performance, no spiritual costume, no psychological branding. You no longer need to prove growth because growth has become internalized. You are less reactive, less performative, less interested in control, and paradoxically, more alive. This is what Jung meant by individuation, not becoming perfect, but becoming whole. When the shadow no longer controls your energy, your life does not become painless. It becomes honest. And honesty is where real freedom begins. There is a quiet danger that appears once people first encounter shadow work. They believe awareness alone is integration. Jung warned against this illusion. To know about the shadow is not the same as having made peace with it. Many people can intellectually describe their wounds while still being ruled by them. They can name their trauma, yet remain organized around it. The shadow does not dissolve because you understand it. It dissolves when your nervous system no longer needs it. This is where real transformation either begins or quietly fails, because the shadow is not just psychological. It is physiological. It lives in muscle tension, in breath patterns, in the startle reflex, in the way your body braces before your mind has time to think. Jung understood this intuitively, long before neuroscience confirmed it. He observed that unresolved, unconscious material expresses itself through the body as compulsion. That is why insight without embodiment creates fragile people. They speak in the language of healing, but react like the wounded. True integration changes how energy moves through you before it ever reaches thought. And one of the clearest indicators that the shadow is loosening its grip is this: your body stops preparing for battles that are no longer happening. Think about how often your system has been on guard, reading between lines, scanning for rejection, anticipating abandonment, preparing arguments in advance. This hypervigilance is not personality, it is memory. The shadow carries unresolved experiences that taught your nervous system that safety was conditional, so it stays alert. But when integration begins, something subtle happens. Your shoulders drop, your jaw relaxes, your breath deepens, not because life became safe, but because you became present. This presence is not passive, it is grounded. And from this grounding, another sign emerges. You stop mistaking familiarity for truth. Jung noticed that people often choose what feels known over what feels healthy. Pain that is familiar feels safer than peace that is unfamiliar. This is why people return to the same relationship dynamics. Even after suffering, the shadow is loyal to the past. It would rather repeat pain than risk the unknown. But when the shadow is integrated, your attraction patterns change, not consciously at first. Somatically, your body no longer responds to emotional unavailability as excitement. Your nervous system no longer lights up around inconsistency. Instead, you feel a quiet neutrality. And neutrality is the beginning of freedom, because without the shadow's pull, you are no longer reenacting old scripts. You are responding instead of reliving. Another unmistakable sign your shadow no longer controls your energy is that guilt stops manipulating you. Guilt is one of the shadow's most refined tools. Not moral guilt, but emotional guilt. The kind that says, you owe them. You're selfish if you choose yourself. You're responsible for their feelings. This guilt usually originates early. A child learns that love is withdrawn when they assert needs. So the shadow learns that self-erasure equals safety. Later in life, this becomes chronic overgiving, over-explaining, over-functioning. But when integration occurs, something shifts. You can feel compassion without self-abandonment. You can say no without internal punishment. You stop confusing responsibility with self-sacrifice. Jung believed that morality imposed from the outside fractures the psyche. True ethics emerge from wholeness, and wholeness cannot be coerced. This leads to another profound change. You stop trying to rescue people from their own lessons. Shadow-dominated individuals often become saviors, fixers, healers, emotional anchors, not out of generosity, but out of unconscious avoidance. Helping others becomes a way to avoid facing oneself. Jung warned that the savior complex is shadow material disguised as virtue. When the shadow integrates, this compulsion dissolves. You still care, but you stop intervening. Where growth requires struggle, you allow people to experience consequences without guilt. And this is not cruelty. It is respect. Respect for their psyche. Respect for their process. Respect for your own limits. Another sign appears quietly. Your emotional reactions shorten, not disappear. Shorten. You still feel anger, sadness, disappointment, but they move through you instead of nesting inside you. Jung would say that unintegrated shadow material creates psychic congestion. Emotions linger because they are carrying messages you have not yet received. Once the message is integrated, the emotion completes its cycle. This is why integrated people appear emotionally resilient, not because they feel less, but because they metabolize experience. And here is something rarely discussed. When the shadow no longer controls your energy, your intuition becomes sharper, not louder, clearer. You stop second-guessing signals your body has been sending for years. You recognize red flags without needing proof. You sense alignment without needing validation. This is not magical thinking. It is unconscious material becoming conscious. Jung believed, intuition is the language of the integrated psyche. When inner conflict quiets, perception sharpens, and perhaps the most unsettling sign of all, you stop needing closure. Shadow-dominated people crave explanations. Why did they do that? What did I mean to them? Was it real? These questions are not curiosity. They are attempts to soothe unresolved pain. But when the shadow is integrated, closure becomes internal. You do not need their confession to understand the pattern. You do not need their apology to validate your experience. You trust what happened without needing it narrated. This is when the past loses its emotional charge, not because you forgot, but because you no longer live inside it. Jung believed, the unconscious seeks wholeness above happiness, and wholeness requires facing discomfort without flinching. When the shadow no longer controls your energy, you do not become invulnerable. You become real, and reality is far less frightening than the fantasies the shadow creates. There is a phase in shadow integration that almost no one talks about because it doesn't look like healing. It looks like loss, not the loss of people, not the loss of circumstances, but the loss of identity. Jung understood this phase deeply. He warned that individuation often begins with disorientation. When the shadow releases control, the old personality structures weaken. The coping strategies that once defined you stop working. You don't react the same. You don't perform the same. You don't chase the same things. And this can feel terrifying because for a long time, your shadow wasn't just a problem. It was a structure. It organized your relationships, your motivations, your sense of self. So when it loosens, there is a psychological vacuum. People often mistake this vacuum for depression, but it isn't. It is deconditioning, the psyche shedding what it no longer needs. Jung described this as the death of the false self, not a dramatic collapse, a quiet unhooking. You wake up one day and notice that things which once defined you no longer have emotional gravity. Achievements feel hollow. Approval feels unnecessary. Conflict feels pointless. And the mind panics. Because the ego is built on tension, it needs friction to feel real. So when the shadow stops feeding it, the ego experiences something like starvation. This is why people often try to re-enter old patterns. During this phase, they provoke arguments, revisit toxic connections, create urgency where none exists. Not because they want pain, but because pain is familiar. Jung warned that the psyche resists transformation by clinging to identity. And here is the critical insight. If you try to rebuild your old self during this phase, you delay integration. The discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something false is dissolving. Another sign your shadow no longer controls your energy is that your inner dialogue changes. Not the content, the tone, the voice in your head becomes less accusatory, less absolute. Instead of, what's wrong with me? It asks, what is this showing me? Instead of, I can't believe I let that happen. It says, I see the pattern now. This shift is monumental because shame is the shadow's favorite language. Shame collapses complexity into self-attack. Integration restores nuance. You can see your past without self-punishment. You can acknowledge mistakes without identity collapse. Jung believed guilt that leads to awareness is healthy. Shame that leads to paralysis is destructive. When the shadow integrates, shame loses its grip. And from this place, another change occurs. You stop narrating your life as a story of victimhood or superiority. You no longer need to be the wounded one or the enlightened one. You become something rarer, sovereign. You recognize pain without centering it. You recognize growth without advertising it. This is why integrated people often seem quiet, not withdrawn, contained. They are no longer broadcasting their internal state because it no longer needs validation. This containment creates gravity. Others feel it, even if they can't name it. Another profound shift happens in how you relate to time. Shadow-dominated individuals live psychologically in the past or future. Regret, anticipation, anxiety, rehearsal. But when the shadow releases, your attention returns to the present, not as mindfulness practice, as nervous system regulation. You are where your body is. This presence changes how others experience you. You listen without preparing responses. You speak without strategizing outcomes. You leave situations without emotional residue. Jung believed the integrated psyche exists in symbolic time, not linear urgency. This is why urgency disappears. You still act, but without desperation. And then something deeply unsettling occurs. You stop feeling special, not in a nihilistic way, in a liberating one. The need to be unique often masks fear of insignificance. When the shadow integrates, this fear dissolves. You don't need to be exceptional to feel worthy. You don't need to stand out to feel real. You are enough, without narrative. This is one of the ego's greatest deaths and one of the soul's greatest freedoms. Jung believed that inflation, the need to feel superior or chosen, is a shadow defense. When it collapses, humility emerges naturally, not humiliation. Humility, the ability to be fully human, without apology. This also changes how you experience love. Shadow-dominated love is transactional. If I give enough, I'll be chosen. If I understand enough, I'll be safe. If I heal enough, they'll stay. But integrated love is spacious. You give without depletion. You receive without suspicion. You allow without attachment. You no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. And perhaps the clearest sign, your shadow no longer controls your energy, is this. You stop trying to arrive somewhere psychologically. No more chasing closure. No more waiting to feel complete. No more imagining a future version of yourself who finally gets to rest. Rest happens now, not because everything is resolved, but because nothing is being resisted. Jung believed wholeness is not the absence of conflict, but the capacity to hold opposites. Without fragmentation, you can be strong and uncertain, soft and boundaried, grounded and open, and you no longer rush to resolve these contradictions. You let them coexist. This is maturity. This is integration. And this is why, when the shadow no longer controls your energy, life does not become lighter. It becomes deeper. There comes a moment when the work stops feeling like work, not because you've finished healing, but because you are no longer fighting yourself. This is the final sign. Your shadow no longer controls your energy. You stop managing your inner world and start inhabiting it. Jung believed true individuation is not dramatic. It is ordinary, not loud, not performative, not visible to most, but unmistakable to those who have done the work. At this stage, your emotional life becomes quieter. Without becoming empty, you still feel anger, but it doesn't hijack you. You still feel sadness, but it doesn't define you. You still feel desire, but it doesn't distort your judgment. Emotions move through you instead of owning you. This is emotional sovereignty, and it is rare because most people are not ruled by circumstances. They are ruled by unfinished inner conflicts. The shadow thrives where reaction is automatic. But now, there is a pause, a space between stimulus and response. And inside that space, you live. You no longer confuse intensity with truth. You no longer mistake emotional charge for meaning. You no longer need to react to prove that you exist. Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. At this stage, fate loosens its grip, not because life becomes predictable, but because you become grounded. Things still happen. People still disappoint you. Loss still arrives, but it no longer fractures your center. Your nervous system does not collapse under pressure. Your identity does not dissolve under stress. You bend without breaking. Another unmistakable shift appears. You stop trying to be understood. This is not resignation. It is self-trust. You no longer explain yourself to feel safe. You no longer over-articulate to prevent abandonment. You no longer translate your soul into a language others can digest. You speak clearly, or you remain silent. Both feel honest. Jung believed the individuated person does not seek consensus. They seek coherence. And coherence is internal. You align your actions with your values. You align your words with your body. You align your relationships with your nervous system. And when something is misaligned, you feel it immediately, not as anxiety, as information. This is the body finally being heard. Another sign appears quietly. You stop spiritualizing your wounds. No more turning pain into identity. No more wearing trauma as wisdom. No more romanticizing suffering. You respect your wounds without centering them. Healing becomes private, sacred, unadvertised. Jung warned that identifying with one's wounds is another shadow trap. At this stage, you let the wound inform you without defining you. You also stop seeking permission to be whole. You don't wait for closure. You don't wait for apologies. You don't wait for understanding. You move on without bitterness, not because others deserve forgiveness, but because your energy does. This is one of the clearest markers that the shadow has released control. Your attention returns to life, to craft, to creation, to curiosity. You become interested again, not obsessed, not addicted, interested. And this interest is quiet joy. Jung believed that joy is not excitement. It is alignment, and alignment feels calm. Perhaps the most profound change is this. You no longer need to protect your energy because you are no longer leaking it. Boundaries become effortless, not because you are rigid, but because you are clear. You don't argue boundaries. You embody them. You don't defend your needs. You honor them. You don't chase connection. You allow resonance. This makes some people uncomfortable because they can no longer hook into you. They may call you distant, detached, different, but you know the truth. You are present, more present than you have ever been. Jung believed that the integrated individual does not belong to the crowd or against it. They stand apart, not above, not below, apart. And from this position, life becomes strangely simple. Not easy, simple. You choose fewer things, but you choose them deeply. You invest where there is reciprocity. You walk away where there is depletion. You rest without guilt. You act without frenzy. You trust your rhythm. And finally, there is this realization. The shadow never disappears. It transforms. It becomes an advisor. Instead of a tyrant, you listen to discomfort without obeying it. You acknowledge fear without surrendering to it. You integrate instinct without being ruled by it. This is what Jung meant by wholeness. Not purity, not perfection, but integration. Light and dark, in dialogue, ego and unconscious, in cooperation. This is the moment. Life stops feeling like a battle and starts feeling like participation. You are no longer trying to escape yourself. You are no longer trying to fix yourself. You are living with yourself. And if you felt this shift, even slightly, you are already further along than most. This is not a trend, not a personality type, not a phase. It is a threshold, and crossing it changes everything. If this message resonated with you, if you felt recognition instead of inspiration, then this channel was made for you. Subscribe to Inner Phoria if you are committed to depth over performance, integration over motivation, and truth over comfort. Write in the comments, I choose integration, because naming a path is the first act of walking it. And stay with this work, not to become someone else, but to finally become whole.